Joining me today is Steve Douglas, CEO of the Midwest Development Commission. He'll be speaking at IR's Iron Ore Project Development and Logistics Conference on the 27th to 28th of June 2011 in Perth. Hello Steve, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, good morning, James.
Why is it important to consider social infrastructure in resources projects?
Well, it's a social infrastructure end of the day that's really going to enable our communities to capture the longer term, the sustainable benefits of major projects. So if you really want to attract people, for instance, to at least a proportion of workforces to live and work in mines and in communities nearby, then we really need to have that social infrastructure in place.
What have been the major hurdles in planning social infrastructure for major Midwest projects?
Yeah, look, that's a good question, James. One of the major hurdles is actually getting data on not only the infrastructure. I think that's probably reasonably easy to get, if you like, the capacity of existing social infrastructure. I suppose the difficult part though is really understanding population scenarios and population projections going forward, and trying to line up the time frames of when that population might eventuate, if you like, or the workforces might eventuate, and then trying to determine, well, what proportion of that workforce might reside locally, and then determine, well, what is the capacity of the infrastructure as it exists, what are the triggers which require it, which would enable us to inform decision making about enhancing the capacity of the infrastructure, building new infrastructure. So, there's a lot of steps there, but probably one of the critical ones, or the most critical one, is having robust, reliable population data going forward.
How have you captured opportunities from major projects in developing win-win initiatives?
Well, particularly around, again, that social infrastructure, James, that's one example. I suppose to the extent that we can have the timely provision of social infrastructure in our communities, and I'm talking about education, health, whether it's law and order, but also broader into the amenity side, lifestyle side of things, swimming pools and recreation and sporting facilities and so forth. To the extent that we provide those in communities in order to capture some of the workforces involved in local resource projects, then that's good for the communities, obviously. But we also think that's very good for the resource projects also, because those people that take up that opportunity, I would suggest, are likely to be less transient, less mobile than perhaps others are on fly-in, fly-out or drive-in, drive-out rosters. But that's about the social side. There's been a fairly large emphasis in this region, and certainly through the Midwest Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and we're certainly working with the City of Gelton Glenelg, Shire of Maiwar, Shire of Perenjori, ourselves, the Midwest Development Commission and others. Certainly been a strong emphasis on what we can do to make sure our business base also is involved in major projects. And to that extent, through the Midwest Chamber of Commerce and Industry, there is a position called a Midwest Procurement Officer, whose role is very much to broker business opportunities for major projects. And so their role is to understand what the needs of the resources projects are, what tenders might be coming out, when, what's required, and then make sure our business base understands those requirements and the tenders and the timeframes, and working the other way too, and that is informing major contractors and so forth of the local business capability. So that's also an area that we're working very hard on, and the Chamber is doing a great job on that particular front. And the other area, James, is looking at how we can capture more opportunities for our Indigenous population. The Midwest has an Indigenous population of around about 10-11% and relatively high unemployment, and that's an area that there has been a lot of focus on in the last 3 or 4 years, both from the Indigenous people, from local organisations, from the areas like Department of Training, from Durack Institute of Technology, and also from the resources sector itself through the Joint Iron Ore Alliance led by Rob Jeffries. So there's been a fair bit of emphasis around capturing Indigenous opportunities as well.
What is the key to success in the provision of social infrastructure?
Go back to my earlier point, I think the key is getting some good, robust information, particularly around population data, and particularly around about the capacity of existing infrastructure, and then identifying triggers and milestones for the provision of new social infrastructure. One of the things that we've been able to do, James, in the last state budget is been able to secure $220 million through state government allocation via royalties for regions to provide for social and community infrastructure right across the Midwest region. Now, that followed 9 to 12 months of fairly extensive and intensive consultation with regional stakeholders, and particularly local communities and local governments right across the Midwest. So we'll be spending a fair bit of our time, effort and resources over the next 4 years, making sure that that $220 million is used wisely in further enhancing community infrastructure. And part of the reasoning for that is to make sure that we can set up our towns and communities so they can capture those opportunities from major projects and support those projects.
Steve, you're speaking at IR's Iron Ore Project Development and Logistics Conference on the 27th to 28th of June 2011 in Perth. What will be the focus of your presentation?
I think, look, I will be touching, well not just touching, I will be providing a more in-depth outline, if you like, of that investment plan that I just talked about. And one of the other things I'd like to talk more about is that issue of population and projections and robust data and so forth. We're also working with the Western Australian Planning Commission and the Department of Planning on providing more up-to-date data. And James, one thing I haven't mentioned so far is the fact that the Western Australian Planning Commission has established in the Midwest a Midwest Regional Planning Committee, and that is also looking at the strategic issues, if you like, right across the Midwest from a planning perspective. They've already identified a range of major issues that they'll be focusing their effort on over the next number of years also. And they're also very much focused on that issue of securing or developing good, robust population models going forward.
Steve Douglas, many thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, James.